Chapter 16, the Special Senses, Part 1. The special senses are the sensations we detect that are localized to the head. They include things like vision, taste, smell, hearing, equilibrium. Yeah, equilibrium. Gustation is the sense of taste, and as we know, it's localized to the mouth, primarily to the papillae, the bumps found on the superior surface of the tongue, and these bumps are known as taste buds. There are a few different kinds of taste buds. Uh, in the back of the tongue, toward the posterior region, there is these very large taste buds called the valate papillae, and they form sort of an inverted V. On the sides of the tongue are the foliated papillae, and these are only active in young children, which in my mind is terribly unfair because they don't know, they can't appreciate taste. And then for the rest of the tongue, we have the fungiform papillae. They're sort of mushroom shaped and all over the surface of the tongue, front to back. The papillae, the taste buds, have within them structures called gustatory hairs that are coming out of the opening before. The gustatory hairs are part of the chemoreceptor cells. So the receptor cells, the gustatory hair cells, have little gustatory hairs that protrude slightly out through the taste pore. The taste pore allows saliva and chemicals dissolved in the saliva to make access to the gustatory hairs. And as the chemicals binding to the gustatory hairs, that is the stimulus. So chemicals are what we taste, and they bind to the gustatory hairs. Those are the gustatory hair cells that are the sensory receptors, and then they pass the signal on to the sensory neurons to send it to the brain. So there are 5 primary tastes: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. Umami's somewhat more recent taste that's been discovered, say, I don't know, 20 years ago or so. It is a meaty or savory taste. The main chemical that stimulates it is monosodium glutamate. And yeah, so that is one of the 5 primary tastes. There are probably more tastes, or it's more complicated because, for instance, we can kind of taste the difference between something that has a high fat content versus a low fat content. We know we have that sensation that maybe isn't really a taste from the hotness and spiciness of food. So this is probably going to end up being more complicated. All right, so the taste sensation, we have the various taste buds binding the chemicals. And as we know, the anterior portion, 2/3 portion of the tongue, is innervated by the facial nerve. So the gustatory sensation, the taste sensation will travel via the facial nerve to the medulla oblongata, the brain stem. And then also for the posterior third of the tongue, we have the taste sensation traveling via the glossopharyngeal tongue. So those 2 cranial nerves carry the taste sensation to the medulla oblongata, to the brain stem. From there, it gets sent up to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus to the insula, where the primary gustatory area is. So again, sense of taste passes through the thalamus. So from the tongue to the brainstem, from the brainstem to the thalamus, from the thalamus to the insula's primary gustatory area. Olfaction, as we know, is localized to the roof of the nasal cavity in a structure called the olfactory epithelium. Olfaction is, of course, the sense of smell. And the structure has various epithelial cells that are able to produce mucus and also olfactory sensory neurons. And the olfactory sensory neurons are also the receptors. They are the chemoreceptors. So chemicals that we inhale into the nasal cavity, some of those are able to dissolve in the mucus. And if they dissolve in the mucus and bind to the olfactory sensory neurons, that generates the signal that travels through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, through the skull, up to the brain, where they will synapse in the olfactory bulb of the brain. From there, the olfactory bulb will send signals via the olfactory tract to the temporal lobe's primary olfactory area. So olfaction, smell, bypasses the thalamus, does not go through the thalamus. Vision. Well, vision localized to our eyes. There's a lot of accessory structures. We have the eyebrows and eyelashes that are there for protection, to protect and prevent things from falling into the eye, although often it seems like it's an eyebrow or eyelash that falls into the eye. The eyelids themselves provide protection and help spread moisture around in the eye. The conjunctiva is a thin layer of mucous membrane around the anterior portion of the eye and underneath the bottoms of the eyelids. It helps to produce mucus that helps to lubricate the eye. However, the conjunctiva does not cover the cornea. And if you have a pink eye ever, that means you got some sort of infection of the conjunctiva, either viral or bacterial infection. Lacrimal gland. Lacrimal gland is found in superior to the eye on the lateral side. The lacrimal gland produces lacrimal fluid, tear fluid. We always produce a small amount of lacrimal fluid to help keep the eye moist and help keep it clean from any dust or particulates. And then the fluid, the tear fluid, the lacrimal fluid will then go to the medial corner of the eye and travel through passageways to the nasal cavity. So our orbits of the eyes are connected to the nasal cavity, allowing fluid to transmit down into the nasal cavity. And this is why when you cry, you often get a runny nose, because then excessive amounts of tear fluid, of lacrimal fluid, are entering the nasal cavity. We also have muscles, 6 set of muscles that control the movement of the eye. We have the 4 rectus muscles, the superior rectus muscle going to the top, inferior rectus muscle going to the bottom, lateral rectus muscle on the lateral side, medial rectal muscle on the medial side, and they move the eyeball in the direction they are located. So inferior rectus moves it inferiorly, lateral rectus moves it laterally, medial rectus moves it medially, superior rectus moves it superiorly. Then we also have 2 other muscles called the obliques. We have the superior oblique, which goes along the top and then makes a U-turn and connects to more the back of the eye. And the inferior oblique, which starts off with its origin in the maxilla and then it heads down and inserts into the back of the eye. And the obliques move the eye opposite to the direction they're in. So inferior oblique will move the eyeball superiorly. The superior oblique will move the eyeball inferiorly. So that's how those 6 muscles work. And they are controlled, as we know, by 3 cranial nerves, the oculomotor nerve, the abducens nerve, and the trochlear nerve. Here is the eyeball. The eyeball has an outer layer called the fibrous layer. The fibrous layer goes all the way around the outside of the eye. It includes the sclera. The sclera is the opaque, tough, strong portion of the eyeball. It is the white of the eye, but as you can see, it makes up the bulk of the outer region of the eye. And then the cornea is the transparent portion that is anterior. It is transparent, the cornea is, to allow light to pass through the cornea to enter deeper into the eye. And the cornea also focuses light somewhat. So cornea anterior, transparent, light passes through. Sclera, the rest of the eye, opaque, very strong, tough, gives the eye its structure. Then we have the vascular layer or middle layer. It is called the vascular layer because it has lots of blood vessels. Vascular blood vessels provide nutrients for the eye. The posterior and middle portions of the eye's middle layer is made up of a structure called the choroid. The choroid, again, has lots of blood vessels. It's also very dark in color so that it absorbs excess light coming into the eye. Then toward the anterior region, we have the ciliary body. Ciliary body is a ring of smooth muscle tissue. This ring of smooth muscle tissue goes all the way around the lens. There are actually fibers going from the ciliary body to the lens to allow it to control the focus of the lens, the shape of the lens to focus light. And then anterior to the lens is another ring of smooth muscle tissue called the iris. The iris is the colored part of the eye. If you have brown eyes, they're talking about your iris. Blue eyes, talking about your iris. And the iris's job is to control the size of the pupil. The pupil is just a hole. Light passes through this hole. So we have light going through the cornea, through the pupil, through the lens, to the back of the eye. And again, choroid, ciliary body to control the shape and focus of the lens, ciliary irises to control the size of the pupil. Then we have the retina. The retina is only primarily in the back and middle regions of the eye. The retina is the most inner surface, and it houses the photoreceptors. So it has a pigmented layer to absorb excess light, and it has photoreceptors and the sensory neurons that the photoreceptors will pass the stimulus, the information onto. So here is a little cartoon of a cross-section of the retina. Here is the sensory neurons. Here is the photoreceptors, the rods and cones, and here's that pigmented layer of the retina. So here is the open space, the posterior region of the eye. Light will be traveling through all these sensory neurons to eventually reach the photoreceptors. The rods work best in dim light, and they are able to detect only in black and white and gray. So they only see black and white and gray. That's why when you get up late at night, everything was kind of washed out, not very colorful. The cones, on the other hand, work best in bright light, and they detect colors. It is the cones that detect the various colors that we see. And when these receptors are stimulated, they transmit their signals to sensory neurons that send it to other sensory neurons that eventually leave the eyeball to form the optic nerve. So when we look at the retina, we're also able to see the optic disc. The optic disc is this light area here. It is formed from the various sensory neurons, axons, as they leave the eyeball in the back of the eye to form the optic nerve. The optic disc is also known as the blind spot because it does not have any photoreceptors. So there's a little spot in the back of the eye with no photoreceptors called the optic disc. That means there are two little empty spots where we can't see anything in our field of vision. However, our brain just fills in the blanks with the information it's detecting around those spots. We also have another spot called the fovea centralis. Fovea centralis, directly across from the pupil, is where we get the absolute best vision, the maximum visual acuity. We see things the most crispest and clearest. In the fovea centralis, we only have cones. There are no rods. The posterior chamber of the eyeball is filled with a gelatinous mass called the vitreous humor, and it helps to fill up the space, hold the structure of the eye, and hold the retina to the walls of the eyeball. So light arrives from outside, travels through the cornea, then passes the anterior chamber through the pupil, then into the lens where it is better focused, passes through the vitreous humor, and eventually reaches the retina where it will stimulate those photoreceptors. So that is the path light travels to get to the photoreceptors. Myopic is nearsighted. That means you have trouble seeing things far away from you because the lens is not focusing to the back of the eye when things are far, far away. So you need corrective lenses to correct for that. Hyperopic is farsighted. You can see things far away but not near. In this case, the lens is unable to focus things near because it ends up trying to shoot for too far away. It's missing the back of the eye. And so that would also need corrective lenses to correct that. And of course, when you get old enough, you're both myoptic and hyperoptic. Blindness, three main very common ways to go blind. There are cataracts. Cataracts are when the lenses slowly become filled with little opaque structures. The lenses lose their transparency, blocking light, preventing it from entering. So this image here is someone who's beginning to develop cataracts. Glaucoma is when the pressure in the eye is getting too high. This can damage the retina, causing you to lose the outer fields, and then slowly over time lose more and more of your field of vision. And then age-related macular disease. This degenerative disorder actually starts in the fovea centralis in the center. And so people lose the center of their field of vision, and then slowly over time that will spread out to also take out their peripheral vision. And that is it for this part of the lecture.